live after we get started, and I think that's fine. So, hi there, everybody. I'm Laura Brandis, and I'm the Communications Director at the Polis Water Sustainability Project here at the University of Victoria. I want to thank everyone who's on the line for being here today at the third webinar in this season of Polis's Creating a Blue Dialogue webinar series. The inspiration for today's webinar is a new book that was recently published by the Environmental Law Centre at the University of Victoria. The book is called Maintaining Natural BC for Our Children, Selected Law Reform Proposals, and you can see the cover on the slide. The book is a series of 35 short articles on important environmental law reforms that the next BC provincial government should perhaps be considering. Polis was a partner on this publication, and our team here contributed some background material on water law reform and sustainability priorities. And joining us at today's webinar are three of the contributing authors to the book who have expertise in topics related specifically to water, policy, law, and regulations. But before I introduce the speakers, I want to say a thank you to all of our webinar partners and sponsors, specifically to our series partners, the Canadian Water Network, Water Canada Magazine, and the Centre for Global Studies, where Polis is housed here at the University of Victoria. For this specific webinar, the Environmental Law Centre, West Coast Environmental Law, and the Coastal Zone Canada Association, as well as our funding supporters, whose logos you can see there. And I also want to go through some housekeeping items before we get started. If you've attended our webinars before, you'll be familiar with this drill. So first off, audio. As you've all probably realized, I have a blanket mute on everybody in the room. The reason for this is to get rid of any extraneous background noise, any weird feedback or sounds emerging out of the ether. If for some reason your line is unmuted, you can press *6 and that will mute you. And if you're listening through the computer, your line is automatically muted. But that leads me to the question period. And the way that we'll handle questions so that we can hear from everybody in the room is we'll use the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen there. So at the end of all three presentations, we'll have our discussion period. So you can just type your questions right in there. I'll moderate and read them out, and all of our speakers will be on the line as a panel to answer your questions. And to start using that chat box right away, I would like to invite you to introduce yourselves. I always like to get a sense of the community that we have in the room here today. So if you don't mind letting us know who you are, what organization you're with, and also how many people are listening at your end. That'll help paint a really nice picture of who we're spending our morning with. And as you do that, I would like to introduce our speakers. So Calvin Sanborn is the Legal Director at the Environmental Law Centre here at the University of Victoria. And in fact, his office is in the building that's right across the street from our offices here at Polis. Calvin has practiced environmental law in BC for over 30 years and has been counsel on numerous leading environmental cases. He has also published widely on environmental law issues in both academic and popular outlets. And he's a contributing author and also the editor of the new book that we're drawing on today. Amongst the many highlights of Calvin's CV, he drafted the first endangered species bill ever presented to federal parliament. That was back in 1990. And in 2011, the City of Victoria awarded Calvin the title of Honorary Citizen for his good work at the Environmental Law Clinic. Our second presenter today is Andrew Gage. He is staff counsel at West Coast Environmental Law. Before becoming a lawyer, Andrew started his career as an environmental activist. And in fact, he was accepted into law school shortly after being arrested for protesting logging in Clayoquot Sound on Vancouver Island. While in law school, Andrew helped found UVic's Environmental Law Centre, and he also volunteered with the noted Indian environmental lawyer M.C. Mehta. And Andrew says that both of these experiences really changed his understanding of what is possible through law. In his current work, Andrew oversees the Environmental Legal Aid Program at West Coast Environmental Law. And he also enjoys playing his violin, gardening, and sailing with his family. And we also have Jamie Alley here with us today. He's a natural resource and environmental management specialist with over 30 years experience in a broad range of senior and executive management positions. After a long career in the government of British Columbia, Jamie now serves as a university instructor in both undergraduate and graduate programs in coastal and marine resource management in Canada and Iceland. In addition to his teaching, Jamie operates a natural resource management consulting firm with particular expertise in oceans and coastal resource management, freshwater and marine fisheries, and natural resource governance mechanisms. And Jamie is Vice President Pacific with the Coastal Zone Canada Association, as well as a research fellow at Vancouver Island University. And we are certainly honored to have all three of these speakers here with us today. So without further delay, I'm going to hand the mic over to Calvin. So Calvin, if your line is muted, if you don't mind just pressing *6, that'll bring your voice back on.
Well, thank you very much for that. You'll have to excuse me, today is my first webinar presentation, so I feel a little bit like a Luddite. Speaking at my computer screen is a little foreign to me, but I'll give it a shot. So today we're talking about this book, Maintaining Natural BC for Our Children, Selected Law Reform Proposals. And this book was developed because over the last 10 years there's been a feeling that other than a number of progressive climate change initiatives, that the environmental laws in British Columbia are not as strong as they were a decade ago. And over the last 10 years, environmental lawyers in BC have been developing proposals to strengthen those laws, and this book is basically a compendium of those proposals. So the book is comprised of 35 chapters on a number of issues, but they're based on a number of reports that are linked in the book. So when you read the book, you'll get a 2 or 3 page short article, like a newspaper op-ed type of article describing an issue, and then at the end of the article there's basic recommendations for change, followed by links to much lengthier reports that have been done by West Coast Environmental Law, by Eco-Justice, by the Environmental Law Center, and others. So the reason that the public impetus for this, I think, comes from the fact that there is a general feeling that BC environmental laws are in urgent need of reform. We look in the northeast of the province and we find Peace Valley residents that fear the lethal sour gas escapes that have killed horses and people up there, and they call for tougher regulations on the gas industry. Comox Valley residents are concerned that there are new mines proposed in the Comox Valley that threaten their drinking water, and they ask why it is that taxpayers have routinely footed the bill for mine cleanups in the past. Both environmentalists and loggers are questioning the short-sighted laws that threaten both the environment and long-term forestry jobs. We find ourselves in a province with more than 1,600 species at risk, and yet BC joins Alberta as the only province without a dedicated law to protect such species. We find ourselves with a Water Act that helps create water shortages that threaten not only fish but also jobs on Vancouver Island and elsewhere in the province. And we find ourselves with inadequate laws to govern the urban sprawl, which imperils the beauty that attracted all of us here in the first place. So we've come together with a number of leading environmental lawyers in the province and developed this book, which basically contains, as I mentioned, 35 chapters of reform proposals. So I'm going to talk a bit about water issues in depth, but first of all, let's take a look at some of the issues that are covered in this book, which is online at the Environmental Law Clinic website. So the issues include a chapter on environmental assessment, where we talk about how environmental assessment law needs to be brought up to international standards of environmental assessment laws, and include assessments that are more strategic in nature, that deal with large issues, not on a project-by-project basis, but on a regional basis, on a provincial basis, ensuring that environmental assessments are done according to sustainability criteria, that it's not just a procedural law, but it also looks at sustainability of projects. We also have a chapter on cumulative effects and the need to have a measure that will ensure that when there are effects from hydroelectric, from oil and gas, from mining, from forestry, that we're not just looking at the impacts of each single sector, but we're looking at the impacts, the cumulative impacts across the landscape of all sectors and all projects, and ensuring that we take adequate measures to deal with those impacts. There's a chapter on land use planning which decries the fact that basically the province of British Columbia has gone out of the land use planning business and calls for the province to go back into that business. There are three chapters on mining, one that deals with mining tenure, and it deals with the problem that we've seen on Pender Island recently, where prospectors have claimed a majority of North Pender Island, much to the chagrin of cottagers on North Pender Island, who have been approached by strangers who've come onto their private property and said, well, I've got a mining claim on your property, so don't touch any of the rocks on your property. Now, so that's highlighted this issue of the need to reform the Mineral Tenure Act to ensure that people, sensitive areas and cottage type areas and First Nations critical lands are protected from arbitrary mining claims. Also, there's a chapter on regulation of mining written by Maya Stano, who's a geological engineer and an environmental lawyer coming out of the Environmental Law Center. There's also a chapter on mining which deals with the inadequacy of security deposits for mines, pointing out that it's time that taxpayers stopped having to pay for cleanups of mines, that maybe the mining companies should be paying for that. There's a chapter on oil and gas, which talks about the need for our regulation of oil and gas to be done by a truly independent commission, that the roles of the Oil and Gas Commission are in conflict, that they're promoting the industry at the same time as they're regulating it. The same kind of problem that led to the BP spill in the United States needs to be resolved in a similar way, to set up an independent regulator and to set up a fund based on oil and gas revenues for the future, similar actually to the gas fund that Christy Clark has been promoting, but a broader type of fund. And also a need to regulate fracking, look at the experiences in Illinois where environmentalists and industry have actually negotiated new comprehensive fracking regulations. There's a chapter on forestry, talks about tenure reform, on run-of-river, talking about the need for strategic planning and very comprehensive environmental assessment for those type of projects. A chapter on species at risk, which addresses that issue of BC standing with Alberta as kind of outliers in the international regulation of endangered species. A chapter on regional growth strategies, how we can make our regional growth strategies more specific and require that regional growth strategies meet specified metrics and not just be puff pieces. We want the regional growth strategies to be meaningful on the ground. There's a piece on carbon budgets that Andrew Gage wrote, and he may mention that today. A piece on energy pricing, a number of other issues here, reforming environmental tribunals, opening them up to the public, where we point out that citizens often don't have the same access to tribunals that industry does. We talk about improving citizen access to the courts and providing for citizen enforcement, including things like citizen suits. In the United States, some of the best environmental enforcement actually is initiated by citizens who have the right to go to court to enforce statutes. There's a chapter on an environmental bill of rights, declaring that the people actually have a right to clean air and water, kind of a revolutionary concept, one that's been legislated by dozens of jurisdictions around the world and some in Canada. We think it's probably time for BC to act on that. There's a chapter on an anti-SLAPP law. That's SLAPPs are strategic litigation against public participation, often employed by developers to stop community groups from talking about their projects. BC did have an anti-SLAPP law to protect community groups from being intimidated legally. That was repealed back in 2002. We think that law should be brought back. There's a proposal for an environment commissioner who would function somewhat like the Forest Practices Board, but dealing with all resources, not just forestry, dealing with mining and oil and gas and other types of resources. There's a chapter on freedom of information. We've just seen recently with the scandal about the ethnic outreach program and the implication that that officials may have been avoiding the freedom of information law by not using government emails. There are recommendations in that chapter actually that deal with that very issue. And finally, there are recommendations on whistleblower protection to protect civil servants that point out that the public interest is not being served. So I'm just going to, oh, there we go. Now, specifically, we deal with water issues, including a chapter which talks about revision of the Water Act and points out a number of things about what we need in a new BC Water Act. A critical first thing is we need to ensure that in-stream flows of streams are protected. Right now we have so many streams that are oversubscribed, that there's licensing for up to 100% more of their stream flow, and we're saying that there need to be a statutory protection of in-stream flows to protect fish and biodiversity. The chapter, which is written by Deborah Curran of our group here at the Environmental Law Center, also puts forward the proposition that we need regional watershed agencies to deal with watersheds that cross jurisdictional boundaries. We need to improve water allocation because right now we have first in time, first in right to water licenses. And those old historic water licenses may not, in fact, be the highest and best use of water. So we're saying that that we need to have more flexibility in the system to ensure highest and best use, and also to respond to drought and other conditions. We also point out that British Columbia is one of the few jurisdictions in North America that doesn't regulate groundwater, and that it's time for us to begin to regulate groundwater and recognize that groundwater is just part of the water cycle. It should be treated as part of the overall water system. And finally, a new Water Act needs to enshrine the public trust doctrine, that water is held by government in trust for the public. Now, we also have a separate chapter that deals with protection of fish habitat. And this chapter was triggered because of the federal government changes to the Fisheries Act that gutted the fish habitat protections of the Fisheries Act. And so in this chapter, Deborah Curran and Megan Sailing, a student here at the law school, developed a number of recommendations for ways that the province of British Columbia could try to make up for those changes to the Fisheries Act. One of the key recommendations is that Section 9 of the Water Act could be revised to ensure that when people are making changes in and about streams, that that they protect fish habitat. There's also the option, we have water management plans that are available under the Water Act, that those could be used to protect fish habitat. And we also have the Riparian Areas regulation, which has been used in municipalities and in built-up areas. And the Riparian Areas regulation restricts development around fish streams, and there would be some possibility of expanding the scope of the Riparian Areas regulation to try to better protect fish habitat. So I commend that Deborah Curran article to you. And we have something coming in from the ozone here, but we've removed that from the screen. Finally, we also have a chapter by Josh Pattison, formerly of West Coast Environmental Law, on run-of-river projects and on the need for better environmental assessment and better strategic planning and better public participation related to run-of-river projects. And attached to that chapter is a link to a very comprehensive paper the Environmental Law Center did a few years ago on the problems with current regulation of run-of-river projects. Now, I'm just, okay. In addition to that, we have some other water-related chapters. There's a chapter based on a report done by the Environmental Law Center a few years ago on regulating septic systems that points out how we should upgrade our septic system regulations. There's a chapter on heating oil regulations and how we should better protect our water from the leaks from heating oil spills. And finally, one chapter I'll speak in a little more detail on in my last 5 minutes here is stormwater. We did a major report on reinventing rainwater management, designing the green city, and we've been pushing this report in the Capital Regional District with quite a bit of success with local governments, pointing out that stormwater management is a major threat to the environment, that stormwater is probably the major source of toxins in urban waterways in British Columbia. And the impacts of stormwater are such that you'll see the cartoon there about the orca. Washington State has recently found that there's a direct link between stormwater and threats to the orcas, because stormwater washes PCBs off of the landscape into the waterways and into the food web that the orcas rely upon. As you may know, stormwater pollution occurs because we build all sorts of impervious surfaces, and then when rain happens, the rain washes all of the oil and the gasoline and the pesticides and herbicides and heavy metals and paint chips and all PCBs, all the other pollutants from on that landscape get washed across our parking lots and streets and into pipes, and then we pipe that water at very high velocity and high volume into the nearest salmon stream, good place to put it, and it washes out the stream. The volume tends to blow out streams and changes the morphology of the streams, and it also carries all these toxins. So we turn fish streams into drainage ditches, and simultaneously, because of cross-linkages between stormwater pipes and sanitary sewage pipes, we end up with fecal contamination on our beaches. Most of the fecal contamination on the beaches in Victoria does not come from sanitary sewage being piped out into the strait. Most of it comes from stormwater cross-linkages. So we have in this chapter then a number of recommendations for reinventing rainwater management, which basically is pretty simple. What you do is you reduce the amount of impervious surface to reduce that massive runoff that is the source of problems. You restore the water cycle where most of the water historically was percolating down into the soil, and so you get it to percolate down into the soil instead of having it washing across the landscape and into pipes. And you replace pipes and concrete with things that will absorb that water, with soil, trees, and green space. You reduce the pavement, you reduce by putting in porous pavement instead of pavement. You use brick pavers instead of pavement. You use narrow streets instead of broader, impervious streets. You construct rain gardens where water can go to soak into the soil. You put in sidewalk planter boxes, replace curbs and gutters with grassy versions. You use green roofs, retention ponds, and that sort of thing. Just to go back to the natural way that water cycles through. And the recommendations in that chapter then are to require low impact development and new developments, which is now required in Washington State, to retrofit existing developed areas, to require integrated watershed management plans, which now the Capital Regional District is doing. We're saying the province should act to encourage this across the province. You set environmental targets so in the CRD area, we were asking that they set targets of reducing the number of stormwater outlets that had a high environmental concern to 0 by 2017. And you'd use stormwater utility charges where you actually charge property owners who have large amounts of impervious surface higher taxes than those that reduce their impervious surface, and those that use rain gardens, and those that disconnect their downspouts. For property owners that are restoring the natural water cycle, they should actually end up economically ahead, and we should have a charge on people that are paving over their entire lot. And the City of Victoria is moving in that direction. And finally, we need to fix our stormwater pipes. So that's basically what we've been doing in a nutshell. You can get this book, as I mentioned, at our website. And I guess I will now turn this over to Andrew. Hello?
Hi, just unmuting myself.
Okay.
Hi everyone. Thanks thanks to Polis for this opportunity, and thanks to everyone for coming. One of the chapters that I contributed to the book is on the Riparian Areas regulation, looking at the idea of privatizing salmon protection. We're concerned about the Riparian Areas regulation, and not just because the regulation itself has significant impacts on how we manage salmon and urban development around fish-bearing streams, but also because it's really in our view, a poster child for a whole series of regulations that really use private professionals in roles that were traditionally done by government, and attempts to use them to protect the environment, but in a way that in our view is quite problematic. One of the chapters that Calvin mentioned related to regulation of sewage and septic fields raises precisely the same issues, as do a number of other pieces of legislation. Obviously, because this is a webinar focused on water, I'm going to really focus my comments on the Riparian Areas regulation, but I just wanted that as a sort of background to why this is a problem, and why the idea that we need a different approach here applies more broadly than just to the Riparian Areas regulation. In terms of the riparian areas, of course, these are the areas alongside streams. It's long been recognized that these lands provide a wide range of important values, both for fish and for wildlife and for humans. For fish, they directly contribute to habitat, and certainly traditionally, or for some decades now, Fisheries and Oceans Canada did have guidelines related to the use of land adjacent to fish-bearing waters. That was then, the province came on board in the late 1990s and passed the Fish Protection Act, which said that Cabinet could establish policy directives regarding the protection and enhancement of riparian areas, specifically with the aim of protecting precisely these types of habitat. It's important to understand, if you're trying to understand the Riparian Areas regulation, that this is not a normal regulation. I mean, it is legally a regulation, but it's the policy directive means that it's providing direction to someone as opposed to directly creating legally binding requirements. And what it does under the Fish Protection Act is to basically say that once these policy directives are in place, local governments in the areas that are required to implement that policy directive have to incorporate fish protection, riparian protection into their zoning and rural land use bylaws. And that protection has to be basically equivalent to or exceed, in the view of the local government, the protection established by the directive. So that's a little bit unusual, and it's raised some questions around what happens when the local government has not actually implemented the directive properly or at all. But at any rate, when the Fish Protection Act, that section of the Fish Protection Act was first brought into force, the provincial government developed a streamside protection regulation that basically said that everything within 30 meters of the banks of a fish habitat were off limits to development. There were exceptions to that for areas that already had build-up around it, but that was the sort of default rule. And this was after sort of years of negotiation between Fisheries and Oceans, the provincial government, the different stakeholders. Fisheries and Oceans Canada originally went in there with their scientists saying that 50 meters was the minimum that was required to prevent impacts on fish habitat. In about 2002, 2003, the province rethought this. There was some pressure from the real estate industry, and they instead adopted the Riparian Areas regulation. And the main difference is that instead of a default 30-meter setback, the province is now saying if you have an expert who says that you can protect fish habitat with a smaller amount and maybe some mitigative measures, that's appropriate. And so we're going to delegate from, rather than having a hard and fast rule, we're going to delegate the responsibility of considering what's an appropriate setback, or SPIA, the Salmon Protection Enhancement Area, Streamside Protection Enhancement Area, and making recommendations on measures that have to be implemented. And the Riparian Areas regulation provides direction on how to do that to the professionals to some degree. Interestingly enough, they do have to sign off that there won't be any harmful alteration of fish habitat, which is not an issue that's actually directly addressed in the methodology that's given to them. There's a presumption that as long as they follow the methodology, that there won't be harmful alteration of fish habitat, but that's not actually necessarily the case, and there are some problems with that. However, what we've basically done is to move from a set rule, prescriptive approach to a much more, I'm sure the government would probably refer to it as a results-based approach, but with a high level of delegation to private professionals who are hired by the developer. The result, what's the result? How are we doing in terms of protecting fish habitat? Well, I'm sorry, I'm skipping over my slides. Under the regulation, a local government can't approve a development until a report has been received by the Ministry of Environment and the professional certifies that there won't be harmful alteration of fish habitat, or DFO has said that it's okay to go ahead even though there will be damage to fish habitat. Now keep in mind that that only actually becomes required once they've implemented that in their bylaws, and there are some issues here with I'm sorry, I've lost that point. I'll come back to it if I remember. How are we doing? Well, there was a review done in 2009 looking at how often the professionals were delivering assessments that actually complied with the Riparian Areas regulation. And for areas outside of Vancouver Island, there was about 40% noncompliance. For Vancouver Island itself, it was 73% noncompliance. They were measured slightly differently. So very significant levels of noncompliance across the province. And now the ministry thought that this might be due to the learning curve because it's still relatively early in the process, and expressed some hope that this figure will improve. It's worth noting that in the same year, 40% of local governments didn't even have bylaws that were compliant with the Riparian Areas regulation in place, raising questions for huge areas about whether or not this legal protection is actually, it's just not in place, whether it's enforceable. The ministry goal is 90% compliance in terms of the professionals and the developers following the requirements of the Riparian Areas regulation. Just a quick case study. This is a photo of the floodplain of the Salmon River in just outside Salmon Arm. And a large developer, Smart Centers, bought up a portion of this property, mostly on the right, I think, to build a mall. And they hired a very respected firm, Stantec, to do the assessment and basically reach the conclusion that most of this land was available for development, was not fish habitat. The locals were incensed by this, or many of the locals were incensed by this on the grounds that they knew that this property flooded on a regular basis, so they didn't know how this could not be fish habitat. They hired at considerable expense their own expert to do a second assessment, essentially, with some support from West Coast Environmental Law, but they raised a large portion of it themselves. And the result was a finding that that essentially two-thirds of the property, roughly two-thirds of the property, was not available, was fish habitat and should have been protected. There's the mall as it's currently proposed, which is going ahead, barring any further problems for them, on the one-third of the property. But it's a significant victory for salmon in terms of preventing this from spreading out onto fish habitat. It's unclear what would have happened if Smart Centers and their professionals had insisted on pushing ahead with this, because the Ministry of Environment did basically ask them to go back and double check their work, and they did. But it's unclear whether they could have required that. In fact, in my view, they couldn't have required that under the Riparian Areas regulation. Interestingly enough, Stantec, although they did conclude that that if the Ministry of Environment's interpretation of the Riparian Areas regulation was valid, that the two-thirds setback was more or less correct, they still found it necessary to disagree with the Ministry of Environment's interpretation and then the other experts' interpretation, and to emphasize that not only was it not their interpretation, but it wasn't their client's interpretation, which I think is kind of interesting from the point of view of relying on professionals to come up with things, to come up with standards and the influence that a client may have over the interpretation that the professional is taking. And certainly where there's ambiguity, the determination to resolve things in favor of the client. Certainly internal documents that we received through a Freedom of Information request saw Ministry of Environment staff saying that there's lots of cases that aren't actually non-compliant, but that the riparian areas assessments are marginal, and where it's really not entirely clear from the Riparian Areas regulation, despite the fact that it's a very detailed document about how best to protect fish habitat, and that in these types of circumstances, that professionals are not really necessarily ensuring the protection that the fish and fish habitat need. I just wanted to put this in, just because I was reading this book very recently by Dan Ariely. And he has a series of chapters, or he discusses a series of studies looking at the role of the situations where there's a systematic incentive to reach a certain result, and what that does to our our likelihood to be honest, and to interestingly enough, I mean, his position is that in many cases dishonesty is not a decision to cheat or to be knowingly dishonest. It is a bias that is introduced because of these types of systematic incentives. And although many of the studies did not relate to professionals in particular, he spent some time discussing the impact of this on the use of professionals and our reliance on professionals. And he talks very candidly about his experience, this is where this quote comes from, in being retained as an expert witness by a lawyer, and his conclusion that really even professionals, even academics who aren't dependent on these contracts for their livelihood still are in a position where it's not possible to be objective, where there are these pervasive incentives for a particular result. And I think that's got huge implications for how we're currently structuring environmental law in BC. In terms of recommendations, I mean, one of the obvious ones is the streamside protection regulation may have been a bit of a blunt instrument, but it was a lot simpler and cheaper and provided more certain protection for fish than the Riparian Areas regulation does. I think whenever dealing with professionals, it's important to be aware of the trade-offs. That professionals result in more flexibility, but there is an inherent tension with putting in place the checks and balances, the certainty, the transparency that we need in order to be sure that they are doing their jobs correctly. If we do use professionals, the law does need to ensure that there's transparency and accountability. In terms of transparency, the water group, the Wetlands Alliance in Salmon Arm that did the second assessment actually had to make a Freedom of Information request to get a hold of the assessment report. And we've seen that in a number of areas around the province where citizens groups aren't even able to get a hold of the reports that these professionals are doing. Accountability. Right now there's a perverse result where the Riparian Areas regulation is about protecting fish. If the professional does a poor job and allows for more development, there's an immediate financial return for their client. If they do if they ended up damaging fish habitat, however, there's no immediate consequence to that. There's no theoretically the province could sue them for it, but that's not going to happen. And so there's little incentive, there's little accountability in terms of, other than the potential in the very worst case scenarios for a complaint to the respective professional bodies. There's very little accountability. Clearly, as the Ministry of Environment was saying, there's problems with clear scientific standards. And there's a question about whether the province has actually offloaded its responsibility entirely, or whether they can and should, and obviously we're saying they should, retain an overall responsibility and power to protect salmon.
I'm just gonna interrupt. I have lost my connection to the webinar room. Has this happened to you as well, or?
I have not, but I've got a warning saying that that someone, a named organizer, has left the meeting, and that my role will be changed to participant in 5 minutes. So I'm finished.
Let me really quickly log back in. Sorry for interrupting. I just wanted to make sure that everybody wasn't lost. So if you can hear me, and I hope you can, we're just going to take a short break and make sure that the whole thing doesn't close in 5 minutes.
Okay, and I'll, after we do get back, pass it over to Jamie.
Okay, so I'm here. It looks as though Calvin might be gone.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Calvin got booted off.
Oh, is that Holly?
Yes.
Okay, do you want to just...
Rod also disconnected.
Okay, if anybody can hear me and you got disconnected, all you need to do is go back to that URL. That's all I did, and I'm back in the room. I've never experienced this before, but we're clearly still connected. We can hear each other. So if your screen went away, just go back to the URL. and kind of start over. So I think we're ready to go. Jamie, you might as well take it away. I'll assume Calvin will be back on. Holly, even if the room doesn't work, Calvin can just be on the audio because I will read out the questions. So Jamie, why don't you take it away, and if anything else comes up, I may interrupt. I warn in advance.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura. Hopefully everybody can hear me now. Let me tell you a little bit about how this chapter for the book came about. Calvin had asked me to come in and give a hand with one of his students in the clinic and one of their clients who was dealing with a marine planning issue in North Saanich. And after our meeting, Calvin had got the first draft of the book, and he was proudly showing it to me. And I said, gee, Calvin, there isn't any chapter here on coastal management. And he said, and he looked at me kind of quizzically and gave me the opportunity to give him a sales pitch for why I thought we needed a Coastal Management Act for British Columbia. And I guess I must have convinced him because he did let me go ahead with the chapter. So for those of you, it's chapter 16. My first draft, I think, was about 5,000 words, and then Calvin told me to get it down to 1,200. And I think we eventually settled on about 2,000, but that's only because Calvin took over the pen and became one of the co-authors for it. So I will be talking about this idea of a Coastal Management Act for British Columbia. And really, for those of us that have lived here for most of our lives, I'm convinced that our coast is the most single important asset that we have. It's the home to most of our population. It's home to some of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. But today, our coast is facing unprecedented challenges. We're looking at the increased development, loss of public access to the coastline. Of course, we see proposals for new oil ports and marine transportation corridors. The Cohen Commission reminded us of how we have threatened fish stocks, we're losing habitat, and we're losing function within our ecosystems. We're also, as we face climate change, facing the need for emergency programs to deal with earthquakes, tsunamis, extreme weather events, storm surges, sea level rises, all of them caused by climate change. So the simple point here is our coast is facing some of the biggest challenges that we've ever had. Now, it's not as bad as everywhere else. I think this is a slide from Asia. I'll be going to Europe, I think, in June, and I'm sure I'm going to see similar coastlines to that. So we still have time here to take action. So when I say it's our most precious asset, I like this picture of the coast because it really shows us what the ecosystem looks like. We've got 29,000 kilometers of coastline, about 6,500 islands. Within our coastal and offshore waters, there's 450,000 square kilometers. We have over 400 fish species, 161 birds, 29 marine mammals, and as I said earlier, globally significant ecosystems. It's also, as I said, home to most of our population, lives within 150 kilometers of the coast. On that picture, those little yellow dots are the population distribution in 2007. And of course, before the Europeans got here, the First Nations had a culture that was intricately linked with the use of coastal and marine resources. And our oceans and coast are really integrated to the economy and culture of British Columbia. And in future, our ocean's health is going to be linked to climate change. Now, many people assume that coastal management is really a federal responsibility, but both during my career in the provincial government and the teaching that I've done since then, I think we have to recognize that there's three reasons why the management of coastlines is much more difficult than other kinds of resource management. First of all, they represent the interface between marine and terrestrial ecosystems. One of my students was describing salmon as a huge energy transfer mechanism where these 100-gram smolts migrate off the coast of British Columbia, go out to the open ocean, and eat like crazy and come back as 20-kilogram fish and go back into the spawning areas and die and transfer all these marine-derived nutrients back into our land-based systems. And we don't even really understand how this interface works in so many of the kinds of system transfers that take place. Secondly, coastlines to a large degree represent the interface between public and private property, and that whole challenge around market failure within the private market and the interface with public property presents all kinds of challenges. And finally, and I'll get to some more slides on this, the management of coastal and marine resources is an area of really complex but shared jurisdiction. It's not just a federal responsibility. So while Canada has jurisdiction over areas like national defense and fisheries regulation and navigation, we find that local governments who derive their powers from the provincial government have zoning and other powers over local shorelines and coastal waters. And really the province that sits right in the middle has broad regulatory jurisdiction over numerous activities within the coastal zone and ownership of the seabed over most of our coast. So really what we're concluding here is coastal ecosystems are managed by a plethora of agencies from numerous orders of government and including First Nation governments. Now the Supreme Court ruled in the mid-80s that when the Crown Colony of British Columbia joined the Crown Colony of Vancouver Island, they brought with them the ocean between them and ruled that the Strait of Georgia, Juan de Fuca, Johnson, and Queen Charlotte Straits, all the seabed within the jaws of land are owned by the province. And we've never tested who owns the seabed north of the island, but when Canada drew the closing lines under the Oceans Act to establish our offshore areas, or our EEZ, they drew a straight line from Cape Scott to the bottom end of Haida Gwaii, and that closing line, everything inside of that is internal waters, and what we haven't decided yet is whether or not those internal waters belong to the province or the federal government. But the basic conclusion here is that the province does have ownership over a large portion of the coast. So the argument that I make in the chapter is that British Columbia shouldn't abdicate the coastal management to other orders of government because we risk losing control of major decisions and exposing our coastal ecosystems to overuse, neglect, and degradation. So at the same time, while our coasts are under threat, there's also tremendous opportunity for the future. In 2008, we worked with the Government of Canada to do a study of what the BC Oceans economy actually looked like. And we were really surprised to find that it was twice what we thought it was and contributed about $11 billion to GDP, labor income of close to $8 billion, and over 167,000 person years of jobs. And excuse me, my daughter's just leaving for school and the door's about to slam. There it goes. So when we think about the provincial interest in coastal and oceans management, this chart that I have up here, if you look at this, there's areas of exclusive federal jurisdiction, there's areas of exclusive provincial jurisdiction, there's areas of shared jurisdiction, there's areas of uncertain jurisdiction, and areas of what we might call emerging jurisdiction. But even if you look at something like wild capture fisheries, I hope people can't hear my dog barking too loudly in the background. Wild capture fisheries, once a fish is caught and becomes property, then it becomes under the jurisdiction of the government. And what happens next with that fish determines how those social and economic benefits are distributed throughout the province. But when you move down to something like seafood processing, that is largely a provincial responsibility. And until recently, while aquaculture was a provincial responsibility, the province still issues coastal tenures for it. And I won't read out all those other areas, but you can look at them and either conclude that the province has jurisdiction over them or has a tremendous interest in the outcome of them. So other jurisdictions have taken action, and of course the best example that we have worldwide is the U.S. Coastal Zone Management Act that was passed way back in 1972. And there's a reference in my chapter to a 2010 review of both the successes and failures of that act. But while it is federal legislation, it empowers coastal states to develop coastal management programs. And there is a bit of a checkerboard around the U.S., but the analysis has largely concluded that it's been very, very successful. And so you see that U.S. states have comprehensive programs to protect coastal habitats, to manage coastal development, improve coastal water quality, do a better job on citing coastal dependent uses and restricting inappropriate developments, providing for public access to the coast for people and for recreation, to redevelop deteriorating urban waterfronts and ports and preserve historic and cultural features, coordinate and simplify coastal decision-making, provide for public and government participation within coastal management, and to, more importantly, improve coordination between coastal management agencies. Now, through my teaching in Iceland, I've come to also have a look at actions that the European Union has taken broadly to get all of the states within the European Union that have coastlines, which is most of them except for Switzerland and a few others, to take action in a similar fashion to the way that the U.S. has. Now, what about back in Canada? Well, at the time that Canada's Oceans Act was passed in 1997, it was seen as one of the most progressive ocean legislation in the world at the time. And if anybody wants to get inspired about oceans management, go back and read the preamble to the Act. And it recognizes the importance of oceans and provides for ecosystem-based management, integrated planning, and creating marine protected areas. But I think one of the criticisms that one might have of the Oceans Act is, first of all, it's a little bit offshore. But secondly, since the initial flurry in the development of the oceans, the first Canada's ocean strategy in 2002 and the Oceans Action Plan in 2005, much of the promise of the Oceans Act has kind of dissipated. So we've seen very little progress on the BC provincial coast about the creation of marine protected areas, the PNCMA, the Pacific Northcoast Integrated Management Area planning process, which was the large oceans management area planning process, after objections from industrial interest, DFO canceled the funding agreement that they had, and now we're seeing a much more scaled down planning process, and it's really been the province has picked up the charge by planning with coastal First Nations at a somewhat smaller scale. So in the book, I make the argument that we really need this coastal management legislation within BC, and it could do some of the following things. Now, some of my friends that are legislative draftsmen tell me that preambles really aren't worth anything because they're not enforceable in law. And as I said, if you go back and look at the Oceans Act, it's really comforting to know that at a point in time, parliamentarians all had to stand up and vote on some fairly stirring legislation that said that Canadians care about our oceans. Similarly, I would like to see provincial legislators stand up in our provincial legislature and vote on the preamble to some legislation that contained a commitment to the conservation and sustainable management of our estuaries and coastal and marine resources. Then the Act could give the provincial government powers to enter into agreements and to delegate and accept powers from other orders of government. As a parallel to the Federal Oceans Act, it could require the minister responsible for the Act to develop a coastal management strategy. Work was started on this a number of years ago and then was put on hold, and in the meantime, both Newfoundland and Nova Scotia have borrowed the models that were in our draft coastal management strategy, and they have all issued their own coastal management strategies. The Act could also require the minister to do a state of coast reporting so that British Columbians would know what's actually going on. It could provide a statutory basis for the coastal and marine spatial planning that we're doing now that would focus some of those planning efforts. British Columbia has done a very good job in developing a network of marine protected areas. There's over 180 of them right now, I think, but this could provide the requirement to develop these in a network of marine protected areas with other orders of government, and perhaps might provide more of an impetus for federal agencies to undertake the kinds of things that they need to do to help secure the conservation goals within the provincial protected areas. I think it could be very exciting to have provisions within the legislation that would establish a voluntary local government coastal management program so that those orders of government that are closest to the action could undertake programs to protect and restore coastal ecosystems, including both public and private property, provide a statutory basis for emergency planning, preparedness, climate change adaptation strategies. Interestingly, we could provide for the strategic assessment of marine transportation corridors, including decision-making processes for infrastructure and port facilities. One of my largest criticisms of the NEB process right now on the Northern Gateway is, first of all, it's presenting us with a single project out of context as a take-or-leave-it proposition, and the three-member panel that's sitting for the NEB, none of them are from British Columbia. And we need to take control over those kinds of decisions. We could have provisions for the revitalization of coastal communities and more collaboration with First Nations and other orders of government. And there's a bit more detail in the chapter on that. So I think the time for action is now. It would signal the province's intent to take coastal management seriously, fully exercise our jurisdiction and ownership. We can't just leave it to the federal government. Our coastlines are too critical to us, and we need that to secure the future of our coastal ecosystems and all of the communities that live among them. If we don't take action now, we really risk leaving the future of our coast to federal agencies such as the National Energy Board, as I mentioned, private interest in foreign governments, or worse, just to disorganization and neglect. So thank you, and that's it for me. Laura, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks so much, Jamie. So at this time, we're going to start our question period. I'd like to open up the chat box to anybody who has any questions or comments for any of the three speakers. I'd also like to invite all three of the speakers to unmute your lines if they aren't already, to bring your voice on the line for the discussion period. And as you start to type questions, I'm just going to bring up a box here of further reading. So if you're interested, the links here are available to both the book, Maintaining Natural BC, as well as a document from Jamie on managing our oceans and coasts for a sustainable and prosperous future. So if you just run your mouse over either of those titles, the link will come up to take you to that publication. So, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Perhaps we have no questions. This would be a real first. Calvin and Jamie and Andrew, did you have any comments or queries to each other?
There's a question that's just come up, I think.
Oh, perfect. So from Brittany Donnie, just going to make this a little bit bigger. So Brittany, how do you plan to push for the adoption/implementation of these law reforms, lobbying, public campaigns, etc.? So I think that's open to all three of you, perhaps.
Calvin, do you want to go first?
Calvin, are you on the line?
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Oh, great. Yeah, I had this brilliant answer rolling out there, but with no listeners. Okay. Yeah, we're going to start off by having public meetings like Thursday, actually day after tomorrow at SFU Harbor Center in Vancouver. We're having a kickoff for the book, and I would encourage people to come down there at 7 o'clock to SFU Harbor Center for that meeting. Then next Wednesday, we're having a public launch at the University of Victoria Law School at 7 o'clock, a similar kind of public event with a number of authors there and talking with people about strategies for getting this kind of law reform through. The Times Colonist has written about the book. Stephen Hume of the Vancouver Sun is about to do a column about it. The Tyee is actually serializing the entire book, 15 different articles that they're doing. So those are some of the things, and then we're doing things like this webinar to inform government people and community groups and environmental groups, conservation groups, First Nations about the book. But really, it's up to people that are concerned and feel that there should be reform to move forward on that.
If I could just add, I think that the book encompasses obviously a wide range of proposals, and in some cases, the reports, the particular chapters reflect existing campaigns, and there is work being done to press for reforms on those particular areas. I mean, for example, the IPP one that was brought up, obviously there's been a lot of work by a range of groups on independent power projects, and West Coast Environmental Law has been one of the groups working with several different organizations to get sign-on for similar proposals from a wide range of stakeholders. But I think in terms of the idea of a sort of an in-depth push or a real push for any of the particular proposals, you almost have to answer it on a case-by-case, like on a chapter-by-chapter basis. And in some cases, the answer I think is no one is currently really doing much on this, and wouldn't it be good if if someone did? And it's almost a challenge to the movement, to the public. And in other cases, there's a lot going on.
Okay, the next question.
Oh, can I actually just mention one other thing? I see that Dick Cannings is on the line. He's an NDP candidate from Penticton. That maybe, I don't know if Dick can say anything about what that party's doing. I know that we've been talking to all the political parties about this book and been getting a pretty good reception. But I'd be curious about Dick's comments.
Yeah, Dick, depending how you're connected, if you're connected through the computer, you won't be able to speak. You will be able to use the chat box. If you are on your telephone, I would welcome you to press *6 to bring your voice on the line. But otherwise, the chat box is certainly there.
I believe there's a Green Party candidate online, too.
Yeah, so maybe I'll move ahead with the next question. I see Dick he's hooked up through the computer. So, Dick, would you feel comfortable typing in the chat box? The only other option is for you to call in on the phone, which is a bit of a rigmarole. So, yeah, if you feel comfortable offering your opinions there, and I can read them out as well to give a bit of a voice to that. While that's going on, I will move on to the next question because we do have quite a flurry, and we have only about 20 minutes for questions. So, Environment Canada is currently reviewing the metal mining effluent regulations. In a recent consultation session, there was much talk about regulations in BC, Saskatchewan, and Ontario being more comprehensive than the MMER. Would you agree? And is there any way that the MMER provides backstop to provincial regulations? How would you feel about a provision for equivalency to some aspects of the MMER? Example, the Environmental Effects Monitoring Program.
Yeah, I'm not intimately familiar with MMER. The person that would be able to answer that question right off the bat would be Maya Stano, who wrote the chapter on mining regulations. I certainly would not hold up BC's regulations as a model for the world. I know that we've been working on a best practices mining code and have found that in many, many aspects that BC falls short of the world-class standards on mining. But as far as MMER specifically, Maya Stano, who's now an article student at Bullhauser, would be the person that would be able to answer that comprehensively.
Yeah, I'm not actually certain which provincial regulations are being referred to, but it wouldn't be obvious to me that I was that I would agree that that somehow they were better than. I mean, the MMER has its problem, its own problems, obviously, but I'm not sure what provincial regulations are being referred to that would somehow improve the situation.
Okay, I wonder, I'm not sure who typed this question, but perhaps, Calvin, would you be open to having them email you and you could put them in touch with the other...
Certainly. Be happy.
Okay, so guest 2, whoever you are, get in touch with Calvin Sanborn, and if you need his email, just email me. So Dick is responding now. I'll read out his. So he says we have a few things I can say now. Rescinding the equivalency agreement with NEB to allow a BCEA process for Enbridge and Kinder Morgan proposals. We'll be pushing for endangered species legislation and bringing forward a new Water Protection Act. So those are some of the off the top of his head things from that NDP candidate, Dick Cannings. And perhaps he's typing more, I'll keep you updated. A question from Melissa. Given that some marine protected areas, such as wildlife management areas around the Fraser River estuary, has this group looked at the limitations of the Wildlife Act, which provides marginal ability to protect the WMA, need regulatory reform with that also?
Perhaps I'll jump in on that one. This is Jamie here. We did some work a little while ago when I was still with the provincial government, where we really have at least a dozen, if not more, pieces of provincial legislation by which we can establish marine protected areas. And I think once we get past establishing them on a case-by-case basis, what we really need to do is to go back and look at them in the context of a comprehensive network, and to see whether or not we're using the right delegate or the right powers under the right act to establish the protection area. And as the question points out, wildlife management areas are almost the weakest form of protected area that we can have. And if we need to upgrade it by using stronger provincial legislation to achieve the conservation goals that we have, then that's something that we need to do. But at some point we have to sit down and look at how do all these protected areas work in terms of a system or a network, and which ones require upgrading and more clarity around the conservation goals and objectives that we have for them, and a monitoring program to make sure that we're getting there. How's that?
Well, and I think, Jamie, it also relates to the Coastal Zone Management Act and the need for that, in that we've seen in a number of estuaries and bays along the coast that you have this mix of jurisdictions where the province may own the seabed and the federal government regulates the fish in the water column, and then you've got municipal zoning, and there are a lot of things that fall through the cracks if you actually want to protect an estuary or a marine environment in a municipality, and so there needs to be a clarification of jurisdiction there to enhance enforcement, as we saw, Jamie, in the project that you and I worked on. That we actually can't name the area, but it's a very complex network of jurisdictions there, and things do fall through the cracks and they don't get adequately protected, and hopefully a Coastal Zone Management Act would address that.
Yeah, and I think if you want to look at a really simple case, we just have to go and look at raced rocks at the southern tip of the island here, where Canada has been working for years to establish a marine protected area there. But meanwhile, the province already has an ecological reserve that's been in place for decades. And rather than the two orders of government fighting over which one gets to have the protected area there, I'd like to see the co-designation, and this could be something really neat where the two orders of government sit down with the local governments and First Nations governments, and we all bring to the table the legislative and legal rights that we have to get the protection that we need. So you could look in a case like that where the province, which owns the seabed, designates it an ecological reserve, and then the federal government that can control activities within the water column and on the surface might then declare it a protected area under federal legislation. And if there's a role for the First Nations government to play within a co-management situation, I'd like to see all of the orders of government coming together and agree on the conservation goals that we have for a place like Race Rocks. And rather than it being seen as a either-or kind of thing, it would be the governments all bringing their powers together under a variety of legislation.
Great, thank you. So just a couple things to add to that. A comment here from Susan Latimer that what Calvin was saying in that answer is also applicable to interior BC large lakes. And also Chris Aikman, who's on the line, who's a Green Party candidate. I don't know what his riding is, I apologize, but in response also to what Dick Cannings was saying about his platform, Chris says that the Green Book is available at greenparty.bc.ca and lists many starting points for water, forest protection, and better environmental regulation. So that was in response to the very first question about can these reforms actually happen. So a question now from Oliver Brandis, who's my colleague here at Polis, the lead of the Polis Water Sustainability Project, directed at Calvin. Given the range of offerings in the book, all of which won't be implemented, what would your priority 3 items be? And remember, you are with a water...
Okay, so I guess they better be water related. Let's see, priority. You know, I think it's very hard to take just 3 things. That the environment is a very complex thing, and everything is connected to everything else, as John Muir pointed out. So I do think that we need to be moving in a comprehensive way. I think cumulative effects is a very important thing that we need to get out of the approach of regulatory silos, with one silo for forestry and one silo for mining and one for water and one for urban development, and look at the impact on the landscape itself. That's a very critical thing, and it's related, of course, to land use planning and environmental assessment. I think that another one is just moving to more independent and stringent environmental enforcement. Over the last 15 years, we've seen a dramatic reduction in enforcement staff and moving to privatization of enforcement. We need to get government back in the role of protecting the environment. And I guess the other thing would be ensuring justice for nature, just ensuring that that citizens concerned about conservation have standing to go into tribunals and courts and enforce environmental rights. Because historically, legal rights have been tied to property, and they've been tied to protection of physical integrity and protection of cash, and that we need to shift the paradigm a bit so that environmental rights can be enforced and respected.
If I can add to, Andrew here. When we were asked to participate in the book, the question of how would people know which ones are the priority and for the environmental movement as a whole, and who are we to say that, was certainly actively discussed. And I think these are generally proposals where there's groups that's been working on them, and they're obviously priorities for those groups. I think the environmental movement as a whole is looking for ways to work together to try to identify priority areas. And I'll just mention one example of that, which is the Organizing for Change group, which is a coalition of, I think it's now 12 different environmental organizations that on a regular basis select campaigns that they agree are of provincial significance and that they are going to work together to press for. So it's a good question, and obviously we'd love to see everything in the book implemented, but the question of how to decide where to move forward is an important one.
And actually, Andrew, I think one point that hasn't been pushed enough is your point about carbon budgeting. I think on climate change, that carbon budgeting chapter of yours is quite key. Could you just give us a few sentences about that?
Okay. Carbon budgeting has been implemented in the United Kingdom through their Climate Change Act, and it requires the government to essentially, instead of just saying, oh, well, we're going to have a 2020 target of such and such reduction, to express 4-year budgets or in terms of how much they will actually emit during that time period. And then there's and I think the difference of that is actually that they have to show how they will achieve that budget. I mean, if you, what we do currently around climate change is the equivalent of saying, well, we've got a financial goal of reducing the deficit by 20% by 2020, and we're going to carry on government as we do, hoping in some way that we'll achieve that goal. Maybe we'll have some programs here based on trying to find waste. But of course we don't do that. If we have that type of 2020 goal, the public will expect us to introduce a budget that explains what reductions we're going to be doing now and have some sort of game plan about where we're going. And you can do the same thing with carbon and say, look, this is how we are planning to have this 20% reduction. And for this 4-year period, we are going to achieve this type of reduction, and here's how we're going to do it. Here's the programs that go with it. And in the UK, they set 3 carbon budgets in a row, so they actually have sort of a 12-year period covered at any one time. And those can be amended going forward, but there's at least a plan. And the government agencies are responsible for showing how they are meeting their portion of that plan and fitting into that. So it's a planning framework, essentially, and I think it's actually fairly bizarre that we think we can set these long-term targets or even short-term targets, but not have some sort of budgeting or planning tool that ties very directly back to here's what we're doing now and here's how we're going to achieve those goals.
Great. One comment that I had missed from Allison, who's the Protecting Our Resources Policy Team Coordinator at the Green Party BC, and she says that they have been and will be using this new book to inform their policy-making processes as well. So again, tying into seeing these reform suggestions as potential reality. And also the most recent comment that came in right at the bottom of your chat box there from Stan Tamandi. He has some information on the mining resource that Calvin mentioned with regards to our first question. So if you are interested, Stan has left his email there to get in touch with him regarding that.
I think you missed a question, Laura, from S. Christensen earlier on.
Let us see.
Above Melissa's. Do you want me to read it?
Oh, no, I see it here. Given the move from government oversight/regulation to professional reliance approach and the weaknesses identified in that, how to ensure that whatever changes might be made on the legal front, they are actually carried out on the land? Thanks for catching that.
I guess this is probably to some degree to me, although obviously I'd welcome any comments from Calvin or Jamie. I think some of this comes down to enforcement generally. As Calvin says, there's been a collapse, and I don't think that's too strong a word, in environmental enforcement in BC. And I think some of it also comes down to making sure that responsibility and the ability to enforce and to create consequences for doing things poorly is not just with government, but also is available, and clearly the First Nations and community groups are clearly empowered to take enforcement action or something equivalent to it, and that there are clear rules around making sure the information is transparent, available for review, and that there can't be. Yeah, I mean that's a partial answer. I do think that there are that ultimately the responsibility lies with government to do enforcement, but at the same time, we've seen what happens when the government just sort of ignores that, and I think that trend is going to be very difficult for future governments to reverse. They need to do it, and I hope they will, but one way to make sure that it's not, that it's not possible for compliance issues to just fall off the table is to actually recognize that there's a role for others than just government, than the provincial government in doing this. Local governments, First Nations, community groups have an active role.
Yeah, I would just point out that you might want to go to the Environmental Law Center website and look at the report that we did on sewage system regulation reform. There's a link to it actually in the chapter in the book on sewage systems, because it does show that professional reliance has been pretty much a disaster in that area. And the other thing is that Mark Haddock at the Environmental Law Center is doing a major project right now on this whole question of professional reliance, and we'll be coming out with a report in the next few months that will address that, and we'll be making a whole suite of recommendations to government on how to reform that system, but that in many cases has just been a disaster. There were debates in the legislature when we brought out that septic system report with all sorts of case examples of people having their sewage systems depositing sewage on their driveways for months and not getting satisfaction from the company that had been given really the ability to legally authorize their own work. I talk about a conflict of interest, and then inadequate kinds of discipline of the professionals that have been authorized to give legal authorization for systems, where the hearings are held in secret. The professional associations can't even get on the property to examine the system. They can't discipline people that have left the association voluntarily. And then they come up with decisions where even when somebody gets compensated for the faulty system, they were told, well, okay, you're going to get the money to buy a new system, but the condition of this is that you don't tell anybody that this particular company created this debacle on your property. So there's a lot to be done, and Mark Haddock's report, I think, will be addressing that.
It's worth noting that the province, until very recently, was actively pressing to expand professional reliance, and viewed it as a way to essentially deliver a lot more with less resources. And fortunately, I think that the pushback both from the environmental community, but also from, in some cases, industry and a wide range of stakeholders, the professional associations themselves, I think have slowed them down on that, and they're now talking about starting with a couple of pilots as opposed to a broad expansion of it. But there is still a lot of interest within the government in this model, without, I think, a lot of appreciation of some of the problems that they've had.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting model. I know that on the sewage system thing, we discovered that British Columbia was the only jurisdiction in North America that didn't have a government official going out and looking at a septic system to see if it was an appropriate place to place it there. And when I spoke to the guy from the North American Association of Governing Agencies about that, I asked if he knew of any other jurisdictions in North America that didn't require a government official to look at a site. And he said, no, I don't know of any in North America, but maybe in the third world. And I thought that was kind of an interesting comment about where we've come with environmental regulation in BC.
Mm-hmm. So we are at our time mark, and there's a number of other questions on the docket that unfortunately we won't be able to get to today. I'm wondering, Calvin and Andrew and Jamie, would you be willing, if I circulated the questions here from Sherry Boudreau, Linda Sheehan, Steve Whitney, Roger Brown, and Ryan at Living Lakes Canada, if you have just a bullet point or two that perhaps we could then circulate that to the whole group when I circulate the recording, would that be you asking too much of your time, or would you be willing to do that?
That'd be fine.
Okay. So everybody on the line, especially those whose questions we didn't get to, we will get to them, and I'll circulate that to all of the participants. So at this stage, I just want to say thank you to everyone on the line and also to our speakers. And I want to make you aware that our next webinar will be happening on April 23rd. I haven't posted anything about it on our website yet. That'll be coming very soon. And it's focusing on the failure of water entitlements in both Canada and the U.S. And it will be featuring Deborah Curran, who Calvin mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, also authored a few chapters in the book we've been discussing today. As well as Glenn Spain from the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations. And as always, if you want to watch any of our archived webinars, you can head to our YouTube channel, and this one will be posted in the next few weeks. So thank you all. Have a wonderful day. Jamie, Andrew, and Calvin, do you have any final farewell?
Well, we hope to see people on Thursday at SFU Harbor Center for a fuller discussion of the book with a crowd of interested members of the public.
And you want to mention the Victoria one?
Victoria's April 3rd, Wednesday at the Law School.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Take care.